A father captures his daughter and held her prisoner for 24 years. He also fathers 7 children with her. How did he get away with this atrocious crime for so long? My name's Emma, this is Tiki Bar True Crimes, and I'd like to tell you the story of Josef Fritzl. Born in 1935, Josef was an only child. He was raised mainly by his mother, Marie. His father was an alcoholic and left the family home when he was just 4 years old. His father, Joseph Sr., later died during World War II in combat, and his name actually features on a memorial. When Joseph was 21, he married a 17-year-old lady, Rose Marie. They went on to have 7 children, 3 sons and 4 daughters. One of them included daughter Elisabeth Fritzl. Joseph was a qualified electrical engineer, and he had 2 main jobs before retiring in 1995. He worked in construction and also as an electrical salesman, where he travelled around Austria. In the 70s, he bought a guest home which he ran with his wife until the mid-90s. Joseph's criminal activities begin in 1967 when he breaks into a 24-year-old nurse's home and SAs her while holding a knife to her throat. He was also a suspect in the SA of another young woman that same year. He was arrested and charged for the SA of the 24-year-old nurse. He was given 18 months but only served 12. 12 years for the SA of a woman whilst threatening to kill her doesn't seem like a lot to me. As I've said before, some people get more time for burglary. It's also important to note in Austrian criminal law at this time, after 15 years, someone's record is wiped clean. So if anyone were to do a background search in 15 years' time, they would think that Joseph has no criminal record. Joseph began to abuse his daughter Elisabeth in 1977 when she is just 11 years old. She completes her compulsory education and runs away with a friend to Vienna. The police find her after 3 weeks and return her home. She completes her waitressing course that she's taken and finishes in 1984. By this point, she is nearly 18 years old. Joseph senses that as she is an adult and looking for work, she could leave the family home imminently, so he begins to come up with a plan. He lures Elisabeth into their basement on the pretense that he needs to fix a door. While she is holding the door in place, he gets a cloth which is covered in a chemical often used as general anesthetic. She falls unconscious. He traps her in this chamber and locks the door. He has now trapped his daughter in the basement of his home, this makeshift prison chamber. Her mother, Rosemary, has no idea and reports her missing. Joseph comes up with this elaborate story and forces Elisabeth to write letters saying that she's run away with a friend, not to come find her, and if you do, she will flee the country. Joseph manages to convince police and his wife that Elisabeth has probably run away with a cult. Rosemary, the mother, completely believes this and believes her daughter is miles away living with some religious sect. In fact, she is meters away from her. Elisabeth is imprisoned down in this chamber in the basement of their family home for 24 years. She doesn't see the light of day for 24 years. It's just unimaginable. Joseph would often visit once a day and minimum 3 times a week to bring food, water, and supplies. He would repeatedly SA her. Joseph's sister-in-law, Christine, said that he would go down to that basement at 9 a.m. every morning and say that he's drawing up plans for construction machines that he sells. He wouldn't let his wife bring him coffee. He would often stay there overnight. They actually had tenants that rented the ground floor for about 12 years during this time, and they often complained of noises in the basement, but Joseph convinced them that it was just faulty piping to do with the gas heating system. Because Joseph repeatedly SA'd his daughter, he ended up fathering children with her. In 1986, she suffers a miscarriage at just 10 weeks pregnant. And then every 2 years after that, she has a child. So in 1988, she gives birth to Kirsten. In 1990, she gives birth to Stefan. In 1992, Lisa is born. 94, Monica is born. In 96, she gives birth to twin boys. Unfortunately, one dies as a baby, and Joseph actually cremates that little boy himself. And in 2002, Felix is born. 3 of those children, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander was one of the twin boys, actually live upstairs, and under the pretense of Joseph's grandchildren, he manages to convince his wife and social services that these children have been left by Elisabeth, stating that she doesn't want them growing up in a cult. Lisa is left at 9 months old in a cardboard box on their doorstep with a note from Elisabeth saying, "Please look after my child." Monica is left in a stroller at around 10 months of age, and Rosemary, the mother, actually receives a phone call from Elisabeth asking her to look after her. Now, it's believed this probably wasn't Elisabeth, it probably was her voice, but what Joseph did was record it and then replay it over the telephone. And the final child that was brought upstairs was Alexander, who was left in a very similar fashion. He managed to convince social services that these were Elisabeth's children that she had just dropped off. They passed social security backgrounds because, as I said, after 15 years in Austrian criminal law, the slate is wiped clean. Officials say that his reasoning was very plausible, and they believed him. They believed these children came from Elisabeth and that she was off missing, living in a cult. The mother was completely convinced as well. She had no idea that these children were actually the product of incest between her husband and daughter, and that her daughter was just feet below her feet, essentially, in a basement being tortured. The final child to be born in 2002, Felix, Joseph said he didn't bring him upstairs because his wife couldn't cope with any more grandchildren. So 3 of the children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, lived downstairs in this prison chamber. Joseph looked to make improvements to this chamber, and what he actually did was make Elisabeth and those 3 children dig with their bare hands for years in order to make this prison chamber bigger for more people. He also brought them a television, a video cassette, a fridge, a radio, and some hot plates to cook meals. Elisabeth tried her best for her children to give them somewhat of an education. She did actually teach them to write and read. If being held captive wasn't enough, Joseph would torture them sometimes. He would turn the lights off and leave them in complete darkness. He sometimes just wouldn't visit and didn't bring them food and water for days. And you may wonder, like, why didn't they try and escape? Why didn't they just scream and hope that someone heard them? Well, Joseph said that if they did try to escape, he would gas them. So they believed there were gas pipes leading into the basement, and he said he'd just switch that on. He also said that if you tried to break the door down, it would electrocute you. Investigators afterwards said that these threats were empty threats. There were no gas pipes that led down to the basement, and he wouldn't have been able to have done that. You also have to appreciate that Elisabeth has been abused by this man since she was 11, and she has been trapped down there. Her children are born into this situation, so they probably just have no idea what to do, how to get out. They're just completely trapped in this horrible, dank, disgusting basement that has been put upon them by their own supposed family. In 2008, Kirsten, one of the children living in the basement, falls unconscious. She is very ill, and Elisabeth actually manages to convince Joseph that she needs medical attention. Elisabeth helps Kirsten up to the top level and sees daylight for the first time in 24 years. Joseph tells her to get back down, and she remains there for another week. She is taken to the hospital in an ambulance where she has a life-threatening kidney failure condition, basically. And Joseph spins this tale of the fact that the mother is in this cult, she's missing, and she has a note from her. Medical staff are just suspicious. This just doesn't add up at all. Medical staff raise their suspicions with the police and say, look, there's something not right here at all. And police reopen the missing report case of Elisabeth. They broadcast for her to come forward because her child is in hospital and seriously ill. So Joseph starts to panic and he makes Elisabeth write another letter, a recent letter saying that she's in this cult, don't disturb her, and he hands that to police. Police give that letter to a kind of cult expert, and he has serious doubts. He doesn't believe that cult even exists, where it's meant to be as well. He said that seems very unlikely. He also points out that the letter seems dictated. It doesn't seem free-flowing. It doesn't seem like something someone has written organically. Elisabeth is really worried about her child and is desperate to see her. She manages to convince Joseph to let her and her 2 other children that live in the basement up and into the hospital. And they go and visit Kirsten. Once there, the medical staff inform police that the mother has turned up with 2 other children. They are all taken down to the station and questioned. It's now April 2008. And on arriving at the police station, Elisabeth agrees to talk if she never has to see her father again. The police agree, and she begins to tell them her story of how she has been captured and imprisoned for 24 years. She has suffered a torrent of abuse. She was forced to perform sexual acts with her father in front of her children. On the 26th of April, at the age of 73, Josef Fritzl was arrested and charged. Elisabeth was reunited with her mother, Rosemarie, and they all went into care. I've read that the relationship between Elisabeth and Rosemarie is very tense. Elisabeth finds it very difficult to believe and accept that her mother just accepted the lies of her father, that she had run off into this cult when in fact she was in the basement. Rosemarie isn't the strongest of women, and in many sources it says she was also a victim of Joseph. She was manipulated and controlled. They believe that Joseph's long-term plan was to save Elisabeth from this cult and finally bring her home. When investigators start looking at this cell, they find that it's actually located behind one of Fritzl's shelves in the basement. In order to get to the area where Elisabeth and her children were kept, 8 locked doors had to be passed through. And I think 2 or 3 of those had electronic codes on them. That's how secure he kept them. That's how much he wanted to just keep them down there and not arouse suspicion at all. I mean, the amount of planning and preparation that would have to go into this wasn't just a spur of the act thing. This was really, really thought out by a father who, in that role, is meant to love and protect their daughters. And to put this in perspective in terms of the children, Elisabeth was held down there for 24 years. Kirsten didn't see the light of day till she was 19 years old. Stefan didn't see the outside world until he was 17, and Felix didn't see the outside world until he was 6. Imagine spending the first 19 years of your life in a cellar. It's just so horrid. It's so unbelievable that this man did this and he got away with it for just so long. After being arrested, Joseph is questioned and he states that he had to imprison his daughter because she wasn't listening to the rules. He says that growing up in a Nazi era influenced his ideas and ideals around discipline. He believed that his relationship with his daughter was consensual, but then went on to say that he knew it wasn't right, but as it happened so often, it just became normal life. He also states that he was quite generous to his daughter. He brought her flowers and he bought the children books and toys, that he's not the monster that people make out he is. When he went on to talk about his childhood and his mother, he initially says that she was a very caring mother, that she was very loving, but he quickly changed his story and said that he was beaten regularly, humiliated, he was called Satan and no good, and that he had an intense fear for her. However, in 1959, his mother actually moves in with him and his wife Rosemary. And if he was fearful of her, those tables switched pretty quickly, and his mother became very fearful of him. He ended up locking her in the attic, bricking up the windows so no one could see if anyone was in there. He told the neighbors that she had died, and he possibly kept her in there for up to 20 years. No one knows the exact timeline, but that's what is suspected until she did die in 1980. He was evaluated by a psychiatrist, Carstner, who said that his mother was unpredictable and abusive. Joseph saw himself as an alibi child, which basically meant that his mother only had him to prove to the community that she wasn't barren. Carstner also evaluates his motives, and Joseph says that he believes he was born to SA people. He was born to be evil, basically, and confesses that he planned to confine his daughter back when he was first imprisoned in the 70s for that original SA of the 24-year-old nurse. That's nearly a decade before he actually commits this crime, which shows that this wasn't anything to do with an unruly teenager. This was his own personal gratification that he had been planning for years. He also states that locking up his daughter was not the worst he could have done. He could have been far worse to her, he states, and he has the capability of being far more evil, and that she got off lightly. I mean, heaven knows what he could have done if that's what he truly believes. The psychiatrist diagnosed him with a personality disorder, which included kind of borderline schizophrenia and also a sexual disorder. The psychiatrist recommended that Fritzl be kept for the rest of his life in psychiatric care. He was charged and put on trial for the murder of one of the twin boys, Michael, who died shortly after birth. He was also tried for SA, incest, false imprisonment, and slavery. The murder could have given him 10 years in prison, and the other crimes carried a sentence of 20 years. In accordance with Elisabeth's deal with the police to never see her father again, her testimony was given through videotape and it was played through the court. There were over 11 hours of her testimony, and some of the jurors could only watch 2 hours at a time. It was just so harrowing. They couldn't bear to listen to any more. They actually had jurors on standby just in case some of them just was like, no, I've had enough, I can't deal with this. The trial started in March 2009, and Joseph did plead guilty to most of the charges apart from murder and grievous bodily harm when he threatened to gas them. His defense's opening statement said that this guy isn't a monster because he brought down a Christmas tree at Christmas for them. I mean, a monster wouldn't do that. How you can truly believe that this man isn't a monster just because he brought down a Christmas tree at Christmas is, to me, insane. The prosecution wanted life imprisonment without parole, and they emphasised how cramped and damp and disgusting this cellar was where these people had to live. Elisabeth's older brother Harold did testify and say that Josef Fritzl abused him as a child. Fritzl's wife Rosemary did not testify, neither did any of Elisabeth's children. On the second day of the trial, Elisabeth actually does go into court. She is disguised and she sits in the visitor gallery. However, Joseph recognises her, and on looking at her, he goes pale. He just looks like a different man. He basically just broke down and pled guilty to all charges. He was then given life imprisonment without parole for 15 years, and he accepted his sentence and said that he would not appeal it. He is currently serving in Garston Abbey, which is a former monastery which was converted into a prison. If we fast forward to today, Elisabeth and her children all live together in Village X, which is an undisclosed location in Austria. They have all been given new identities, but life hasn't been easy. The upstairs and downstairs children struggled to bond with each other. You got to think the downstairs children just didn't have a normal life at all, and when they came out of that cellar, they were pale, they were gaunt, they weren't healthy at all. The upstairs children had a relatively normal life, even though they were born in the basement. They were brought up by their supposed grandparents. Over time, it's believed that these siblings have bonded. As I say, they've all been given new identities, and hopefully they can live a peaceful life from now on as a family. Along with all these atrocious crimes, he's also a suspect in 3 murders. Now, there wasn't enough evidence to ever charge him or arrest him, but he was a significant person of interest. The downstairs children were known to also be quite scared of other people, which is understandable. The only people they've seen for 19, 17, and 6 years of their life are each other. In 1986, 17-year-old Matrina leaves her parents' home to go meet her boyfriend at 5 p.m. She never makes it, and her boyfriend rings her parents saying, "Where is she?" and she is subsequently reported as missing. 2 days later, scuba divers find her body in a lake, and it has been covered with green tarpaulin. She was strangled just 2 hours after she left her parents' home, and they don't even think she made it to the bus. Her body was discovered opposite Josef's and Rosemarie's guest house that they had at the time. We also have 17-year-old Anna, who was killed by a piston just 35 kilometers from where Josef used to work. And finally, we have Gabriela Supakova, and she was 20 years old. In 2007, she was a prostitute, and she was murdered in 2007, and this was in the same location that Josef was holidaying at the time. That was the harrowing case of Josef Fritzl. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. As you can see, I'm back in the tiki bar, and this is hopefully where I remain to stay. Haven't been doing it recently just because of a lot of noises going on around. But thank you so much for watching. If you like my content, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment, and I will see you in the next one.